be the root and foundation of what would be the perishable, visible, material realms, wishing to unfold the visible creation from that which is invisible. Yahweh willed into being our feminine principle or attribute called Barbalo. All began with Yahweh. Yahweh as Father emanated Barbalo, the Holy Spirit or active force, full of light, life and majesty, she being filled with need to birth, conceiving as glory the eternal Christ power, the Word of the Father.
And it continues, Barbelo asked the invisible spirit to give her foreknowledge, and the spirit consented. When the spirit consented, foreknowledge appeared and stood by forethought. This is the one who came from the thought of the invisible virgin spirit. Foreknowledge glorified the spirit and the spirit's perfect power. Barbelo, for because the foreknowledge had come into being. This goes on to say, basically, it sounds to me like Barbelo was saying, I want this way to perceive things, this way to understand things, and then it came into existence. So he's using that spirit, that divinity, as the power of creation of concepts, of ways of understanding things, and what they refer to as the 5 aeons of the Father, which is what was created through this relationship of thought and want between Barbelo and the spirit. And they are the first human, the image of the invisible spirit, that is forethought, which is Barbelo, and thought, along with foreknowledge, incorruptibility, life eternal, and truth. We're going to pick this up tomorrow, exploring this a little bit more, just what are those things that he requested of the spirit and had come into existence. I still make the comparison to some kind of software program. These concepts, to us, they're words. We need to move past the words and understand the feeling and deeper meaning behind those 5 things. And why were they created first? Through Barbelo and the Spirit.
Now, remember the whole obscuring thing that goes on with these names? Well, there's a very interesting obscurity related to Abiram and Aber and Abar and Abram and Abraham, and it relates to the Bur part of the construct, that preserved part of the construct. And so when we look at constructs or other words or other names, labels that seem slightly related to Bur, we find a serious relationship. And so another Eber is Barbary. And here you see this reiteration of this idea of stepping over, going beyond, transgressing again, overstepping limits, to do wrong, and to sin. And so again, this is the essence of the name Eber. And consistent with the Abrahamic narratives, with Abraham or Abram being referred to as an alien or a stranger or a foreigner, it indicates again that this idea of beyond is related to this idea of alien or that which is foreign. It indicates here in terms of the etymology of or belonging to another, not one's own, foreign, strange, another, other, different, and very specifically beyond. There is quite a bit that goes into this Aber construct. And so you see the traditional constructs such as, going beyond, passing through, passing over. But then you see some very interesting oddities. You see lay, metal, overrun, make partition, perish, provoke to anger, rage, raiser of taxes, rage, remove, transgress again, and be wrath. And here we are at Strong's 5676. We see a bear, which is also a ver. So that B and that V are completely interchangeable. You can say one or the other. It's going to be the same word. And so here you see with a bear or a ver, region beyond, other side, across. And here you see this interesting addition in terms of what a bear or a ver means. It means transgress and trespass, but it also means, interestingly, west. Perhaps that's where that saying, "Go west, young man," came from. Okay, so you see additional transliterations with Ebru, Ebertu, and Ebertan. All of them essentially meaning beyond, going across, region across. And you can see with a variety of the transliterations the same thing with respect to this trespass and transgress. And so here we have Abarim, and this is at 5682 Hebrew Strongs, and it means the same thing, derived from the Hebrew root of avar, okay, with that V, meaning to pass across or pass over. And here you see this reference to crossing over and the land of Canaan. And you see this reference to crossing a boundary with respect to this name, Abarim. And here you see this Abarim being related to the form of Eber, again, trespass and transgress. Now, when we get to 5680, it's very specific about what is being referenced here. So 5680 is this Ibri. And Ibri, the definition of Ibri is Hebrew. It means an Eberite. However, remember, there is no real Eberite, it's Ibri. And again, what do we have here? Trespass and transgress. That is the essence of this name, to cross over, to pass through. At 5681 Strongs in the Hebrew, you see a repeat of this with Ibri. The number of entities related to Set or Seth is astonishing. It is a pervasive name. It is a pervasive construct. You see it throughout various cultures. This is a very ancient entity, a very ancient construct. And you see this name, this entity infused throughout a number of spiritual traditions. What you also see when looking closely is that a number of deities have Set inside of them, or they serve as a cover for Set or Seth. And Yahweh is no exception. It's noteworthy that Yahweh is also another word for Jehovah or Hova. What we're going to do now is look at a number of other names that are related to Yahweh that are subsequently related to Set. These are stand-ins for Set. These are just other names for Set or Seth. Who exactly authorized Abraham in Scripture, also known as Abram, Avram, and the Catholic Church by extension to colonize the entire planet. Who gave the authority to these entities to usurp all of the indigenous people on the planet, to take their possessions, to take their land, and according to the Catholic Church, reduce many of them to perpetual slavery? Who gave this authorization? If you've been reading scripture, you know that this is coming from this idea of a covenant that was made between Abram, Avram, and an entity known as God. If you've been reading scripture, however, you also know that there are multiple entities identified as God. And so, what God entity exactly gave the authorization for this colonization by Abraham, and again, by extension, to the Catholic Church? Who did that? Have you ever looked into that? Some people assume that it's one deity or another deity. Some people don't bother looking into which deity did this. This was done by something called a covenant. And so this was a promise between Abraham or Abram and this entity. And according to this covenant, not only would Abram be entitled to this colonization dynamic, but Abraham's descendants would be entitled to the same thing. As you are likely aware, the major areas colonized by Abraham and by extension the Catholic Church include Asia, Africa, Europe, and America. It's important to keep in mind, however, that Abraham originated, according to the narrative, in the area that is identified currently as Europe. And so he emerged out of Europe and then ventured into the land that would be identified as the land of Ham. Now, some people identify that land as something else now, but that was Ham's land according to the narrative, and specifically Ham's descendant known as Canaan. And so he was in Canaan land, and then was, according to the narrative, given the authority to take over that land, dispossess the people, and then pass it on down through successive generations. And then you have the Catholic Church creating this dynamic wherein they were acting in place of Abraham, sort of a vicarship dynamic, and believing that they had the authority to colonize the rest of the earth and also allot that land to various sovereigns. And so you see again this Berber, that's the land space, Berber, Barbary. So you see again Saracen, barbarian, strange, foreign, unintelligible speech, meaning the speech of a foreigner. And this is interestingly tied to Babylon. And here you see this construct of transgress in the New Testament in the Greek. And it not only speaks to this idea of going beyond, trespassing, but it also very specifically indicates to overstep, and also includes overreaching and defrauding. And here you see very specifically that this construct of transgress not only means crossing over or going beyond, but it refers to this idea of rebellion in terms of crossing a boundary. It suggests that it's about a deliberate action of overstepping or transgressing. It's not an accident. And not only is this transgression, trespassing, about a deliberate action, but it's also very specifically related to going beyond, overstepping, transgressing the laws and commandments that are in Scripture. And so it's a very violating type of construct. It's a very violating name. It's a very violating name. Now we're going to start off with this very cursory review of this name, Tahuti. Tahuti is another name for Yahweh, by the way. This is odd because Tahuti is an Egyptian entity. And Yahweh, although identified as a Canaanite entity, this entity is most promoted in what would be considered Semitic traditions, Hebrew traditions specifically. And so this is the deity that's identified throughout the Old Testament. You will often hear individuals indicate that Yahweh is a deity that was created by Esau. However, when we look at the transliteration of Yahweh, what we find is that Yahweh is more closely akin to Isaac and Jacob than to Esau. So let's look at some of these names so that we can see these relationships and how these relationships form with these letter conservations in these transliterations. And so what you have is Tahuti with this silent D. And then, of course, this interchangeable D. D can be interchanged with T. And then we also have this Y and J interchange. And so when you finish dealing with the interchanges, you see very clearly what's really going on here. And so at first, you see Tahuti spelled in a variety of ways. And then when you consider the transliterations and the swapping out of the J for the Y, you see what's really going on with respect to a specific Hebrew name. And so this Hebrew name is Yehudi or Yehuti. And this is simply a transliteration of Tahuti, which is, again, this Egyptian entity. And here you can see the swap outs more clearly. We are reducing the letters so that you can see what is conserved when it's all over and why these are all the same names. And so here you have these letters that are missing some other letters, but you still see what is being conserved. And so with that DJ dynamic, the J has now been removed, and you can see more closely how that T and D interchange. What is consistent is this Ihu dynamic with respect to this name. So you see this across transliterations, but those other letters are interchangeable, and so it's all the same name essentially. It's all Tahuti. It's Yehudi. It's all the same word. Now this is when it gets really interesting. Now we go back to visit the name Yahweh. And what we find in the translations is an interesting dynamic. And so when you look at the phonetic spellings of Yahweh, you come away with a number of names in terms of these phonetic spellings. And this isn't unusual. We've seen this over and over. What is unusual, however, are the names. Okay, so What you see is Yahweh appears over 6,000 times in the Old Testament. That's with that YAHWEH. And so you have 6,218 times with that specific spelling. But then there are additional entries for this name in this construct. One is pronounced Horus. Why is this odd? That's yet another Egyptian entity. And that particular entity is also related to Set, but in a very interesting way. Now, what we also have when you look down at additional entries is that there is an entity that apparently has been deified, because this name, when you look at the transliterations and you look at the translations, this name is very closely connected in terms of space. When you look at the hard copy Strongs, you see that it's right next to it. Okay. So right next to Jehovah, Yahweh, is Yehuda. Yes, Yehuda. Do you know what Yehuda is? You can stick a J where that Y is, and it'll help you to see it more clearly. So you have Jehuda. Basically, this is Judah. You also see Yehudi, Yehudim, Yehudit, and then again that Ha and Horus. And so essentially, Judah or Yehudi is a translation or transliteration of Yahweh, Jehovah, Yehovah, and Hova. And not only do all of these names relate to Tehudi or manifest as a translation or transliteration of Tehudi, all of these names also are associated with the name Set. And this will allow you to see better what's being conserved and giving rise to this Burr. And so you can see here that the letters B and R are conserved. That means also that V and R are also conserved. And so when you look up top, you see Abram, and you see that BR, and then you see the Ha'ibri, which looks just like Habiru, meaning the Hebrew. You see the B and the R also conserved. And here you see these Arphaxad, Eber manifestations throughout time and space, across regions beyond. You see Iberians, Liberians, Iberians, Hibernians, Iberians, Siberians, and Tiberians. And here's another notation related to the Hapiru, Apiru people. This is a term that, according to Britannica, was applied by the Egyptians to other people or social groups who were of foreign origin. And so when you look at the construct of Eber, Abram, you see that the name essentially is indicating foreigner. And the Egyptians, who are in scripture referred to as Mizraim, those individuals were referring to this collective of people as Habiru or Apiru. And so you see the collective of people given this name by the Egyptians, and it coincides with the actual names that we see in the Hebrew. And so it indicates here that many scholars feel that among the Hapiru were the original Hebrews. Now, that's quite a large contingent of people that have as their essence the construct of going beyond, trespassing, and transgressing. And when we look at history, that collective, this is a large collective we're talking about now, that collective tends to be on the move. And to ask the collective to not be on the move would be asking the collective, this large global contingent, to not be who Scripture says they are. And so, what you also see here with respect to Seth or Set, that Seth is related to the idea of the trespass, the transgression. That is the essence of Set, in addition to the lay Set foundation essence of Set's name. And so, what you might have also noted in Scripture and reviewing the narratives related to Eber or Ibri or Aber, Abarim, you might have noted that not only are these narratives about transgression related to land and property and crossing over and all of that, but there are multiple narratives about Eber seeking to go beyond nature, to transcend natural laws, to take on, that's where you see this taking on of these godlike statuses, this deification dynamic. And so there again is this interesting pattern in Scripture of Eber or Aber attempting to do that which is supernatural. And finally, it's interesting to note that the entity in Scripture that is identified as trespass, as transgression, the bad boys, it's interesting to note that there is also a culture and philosophy among the Berbers, the barbarians, the Aber, the Abarim, the Ibri, Iberians, the list goes on there. There is a culture, a philosophy of the sacrifice. There is a culture and philosophy related to atonement for sin. This is interesting again because that's the essence of the name. The essence of the name is